The sound of my snowmobile engine roaring to life at 6:30 in the morning was music to my ears, but apparently it was death metal to the residents of Pinewood Estates. I had just moved to Fairbanks, Alaska, 3 months ago, and I was still learning the unwritten rules of suburban life in a place where winter lasted 8 months of the year. My name is Derek Sullivan, and I had purchased a modest 3-bedroom house on Timber Lane with dreams of experiencing authentic Alaskan living, which obviously included owning a snowmobile. The morning was crisp and beautiful, temperature hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and fresh powder had fallen overnight. I had every intention of taking my Arctic cat up to the trails about 2 miles north of the subdivision before heading to my job at the telecommunications company. The subdivision rules I had reviewed before purchasing clearly stated nothing about snowmobile restrictions, and considering we were in Alaska, I figured it was as normal as driving a car. I was adjusting my helmet when I heard the sharp rap on my front door. Through the frosted glass, I could see a figure that practically vibrated with indignation. I killed the engine and walked over, opening the door to find a woman in her late 40s with severely highlighted blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore a purple puffy jacket that probably cost more than my snowmobile and had her arms crossed in that universal gesture of disapproval. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite the obvious hostility radiating from her. "I'm Sharon Winters, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, and I need to speak with you about your completely unacceptable behavior." Her voice was shrill, cutting through the quiet morning like a knife. I blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what behavior?" "That monstrosity," she said, jabbing a manicured finger toward my snowmobile. "You cannot operate that noise machine in this neighborhood. It's disturbing the peace and it's against HOA regulations." I frowned, feeling my morning mood start to sour. I read through the HOA documents before I purchased. There was nothing about snowmobiles. Sharon's face turned an impressive shade of red. "It falls under the noise ordinance section. Section 7, paragraph 3, subsection B clearly states that residents must not create excessive noise that disturbs neighbors between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. "It's 6:30, I pointed out, "and I was just warming up the engine for a few minutes before heading out to the trails." 6:30 is far too early for such a racket. I have 3 neighbors who have already called me this morning complaining. This is a respectable neighborhood, Mr. Sullivan, not some backwoods hunting camp. I felt my jaw tighten. "Madam, with all due respect, this is Alaska. Snowmobiles are a normal mode of transportation, especially in winter. I'm not doing anything illegal. You are violating HOA policy, which you agreed to follow when you purchased your home. I'm issuing you a formal warning. If this continues, you will face fines of $200 per incident." Before I could respond, she thrust a piece of paper at me, turned on her designer snow boots, and marched back down my driveway toward a white Lexus SUV that probably had never seen an unpaved road. I stood there in the cold, reading the formal warning letter that looked like it had been drafted by a lawyer. The language was dense and threatening, full of whereas and heretofore, essentially telling me I was one step away from being public enemy number 1 in Pinewood Estates. I went back inside, my excitement for the morning completely deflated. My wife Deanna would have known how to handle this. She had always been the diplomatic one, able to smooth over conflicts with charm and reason. But Deanna had passed away 2 years ago from cancer, and I had moved to Alaska partly to escape the memories that haunted every corner of our old house in Seattle. I was still learning to navigate life without her, and apparently that included dealing with tyrannical HOA presidents. After making myself a strong cup of coffee, I decided to do some research. I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop and read through them carefully. Sharon had cited Section 7, Paragraph 3, subsection B, but when I actually read it, the language was much more specific than she had implied. It prohibited sustained noise above 85 decibels between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. I had no idea how loud my snowmobile was, but I also knew that the 7 a.m. cutoff meant I had been operating it before the restriction even ended. More importantly, I found a section I had overlooked before. Section 12 dealt with vehicles and specifically stated that any vehicle legal to operate on Alaska roads and trails could be parked and maintained on residential property. Snowmobiles were registered vehicles in Alaska, which meant they fell under this protection. I spent my lunch break that day at work calling the Fairbanks North Star Borough offices, trying to understand local noise ordinances and snowmobile regulations. The woman I spoke with at the borough was incredibly helpful and explained that snowmobiles were indeed legal to operate on many streets in Fairbanks, though some neighborhoods had specific restrictions. She checked Pinewood Estates and confirmed there were no borough-level restrictions on snowmobile use in my area. The HOA might have their own rules, she cautioned, but they can't supersede state law regarding legally registered vehicles. Armed with this information, I felt more confident. That evening, I drafted a polite but firm email to Sharon Winters, explaining what I had learned and respectfully disagreeing with her interpretation of the HOA bylaws. I kept the tone professional, cited specific sections, and made it clear I intended to continue using my snowmobile for its intended purpose. Her response came within 20 minutes. It was 3 paragraphs of barely contained rage, informing me that the HOA board would be holding an emergency meeting to discuss my flagrant disregard for community standards, and that I should expect significant consequences if I continued my behavior. She also mentioned that several neighbors had joined her in filing complaints, and that I was creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I waited until exactly 7 a.m., verified the time on my phone, and started my snowmobile. I let it warm up for 5 minutes, which was necessary in the cold temperatures, and then I rode it down my driveway and onto the street. The subdivision streets were covered in packed snow, and while most people used trucks or SUVs, snowmobiles were perfectly capable of traveling on them until I reached the main road that would take me to the trail system. I had gotten maybe 200 yards when I saw Sharon burst out of her house, phone already pressed to her ear. She was screaming something I could not hear over the engine noise, but her body language made it abundantly clear she was not wishing me a pleasant morning. I continued on, refusing to be intimidated. The trails were spectacular. Fresh snow blanketed everything, and the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I spent 2 hours exploring the network of paths that wound through the boreal forest, finally feeling like I was starting to understand why people loved Alaska so much. This was what I had moved here for, not to be harassed by someone who seemed to think she owned the entire neighborhood. When I returned home around 9:30, there was another letter taped to my front door. This one informed me that I had accrued a $200 fine for noise violations, and that the HOA board had scheduled a hearing for the following Thursday evening, which I was required to attend. Failure to appear would result in additional fines and potential legal action. I called my real estate agent, Marcus Thompson, who had helped me buy the house. He groaned when I explained the situation. Sharon Winters is notorious, he said. She's been HOA president for 6 years, and she's driven out at least a dozen homeowners with her petty enforcement of rules. I should have warned you, but honestly, I did not think snowmobiles would be an issue. This is Alaska, for crying out loud. So what are my options? I asked. You can fight it. The bylaws are actually on your side from what you are telling me, but Sharon has deep pockets and loves to threaten legal action. Most people just give up because it's easier than fighting. I'm not most people, I said. Marcus chuckled. I had a feeling you'd say that. Look, document everything. Keep records of when you use the snowmobile, how long, all of it, and you might want to get a decibel meter to prove your noise levels are within legal limits. I took his advice seriously. That afternoon, I ordered a professional decibel meter online and started keeping a detailed log. I also began researching Alaska state laws regarding HOAs and their enforcement powers. What I discovered was illuminating. While HOAs in Alaska had certain authorities, they were much more limited than in other states. They could not, for instance, place liens on property for unpaid fines without going through the court system, and they had to prove actual damages or violations of clearly stated rules. Thursday evening arrived, and I drove to the community center where the HOA board meeting was being held. The building was a newer structure at the entrance of Pinewood Estates, with a large meeting room that could probably hold 100 people. When I walked in, I found about 20 residents scattered in the chairs, most of them older retirees who looked at me like I had personally insulted their grandchildren. Sharon sat at a table at the front of the room with 4 other board members. She was wearing a burgundy blazer and had a stack of papers in front of her that she kept tapping with a pen. To her right was a thin man in his 60s who introduced himself as Vice President Harold Mitchell. The other board members were introduced as Treasurer Patricia Holmes, Secretary Jennifer Crawford, and Member-at-Large Robert Daniels. This hearing is to address the ongoing noise violations and disruptive behavior of Derek Sullivan, resident of 342 Timber Lane, Sharon began, her voice echoing in the room. Mr. Sullivan has repeatedly violated our community noise ordinances by operating a snowmobile at unacceptable hours, disturbing the peace and tranquility that makes Pinewood Estates such a desirable place to live. She went on for several minutes, painting me as some kind of rebel who had no respect for his neighbors. She claimed she had received complaints from 15 different households, and that my actions were reducing property values and creating a nuisance. When she finally stopped talking, Harold Mitchell asked if I wanted to present my side. I stood up, keeping my voice calm and even. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to be clear that I have great respect for this community and my neighbors. I moved to Pinewood Estates because I wanted to be part of a neighborhood while also enjoying the outdoor lifestyle that Alaska offers. Snowmobiling is a huge part of that lifestyle. I pulled out copies of the HOA bylaws and the information I had gathered from the borough offices. According to Section 12 of our HOA bylaws, any legally registered vehicle can be parked and maintained on residential property. My snowmobile is legally registered with the state of Alaska. Additionally, the noise ordinance in Section 7 specifies that restrictions apply between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. I have only operated my snowmobile after 7 a.m., which is outside the restricted hours. Sharon's face was turning red again. The spirit of the rule is to maintain peace and quiet in the neighborhood. I understand that, I said, but rules need to be applied as written, not based on subjective interpretation of spirit. I've also measured the noise levels of my snowmobile. At the property line of my nearest neighbor, it registers at 78 decibels when running, which is below the 85 decibel threshold stated in the bylaws. That's impossible, Sharon snapped. Those machines are incredibly loud. I held up my phone, showing the app connected to the decibel meter I had purchased. I have date-stamped recordings if you would like to review them. I've been documenting everything since receiving your first warning. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Harold Mitchell cleared his throat. Sharon, maybe we should table this and review the documentation Mr. Sullivan has provided. Absolutely not, Sharon said. This is about more than just noise levels. It is about maintaining the character of our neighborhood. Snowmobiles are dangerous. They tear up streets and they do not belong in a residential area. They're legal under state law, I countered. And many of our streets are not even paved. They're packed snow from November through March. A snowmobile causes less damage than a truck with chains. An older woman in the audience raised her hand. Sharon looked annoyed but nodded at her. I'm Louise Patterson. I live on Birch Circle. I just want to say that I have not found Mr. Sullivan's snowmobile to be particularly disruptive. My husband and I are usually up by 6 anyway, and honestly, it's quieter than the garbage truck that comes through at 6:30 every Wednesday. Sharon's expression could have curdled milk. Thank you, Louise, but this is not a general discussion. Another hand went up, this time from a younger man. I'm Greg Norton. I live 2 houses down from Mr. Sullivan. I also own a snowmobile, and I've been wondering about the rules myself. Are we saying that snowmobiles aren't allowed at all in Pinewood Estates? We're saying that residents need to be considerate of their neighbors, Sharon said, her voice rising. And if that means not operating loud machinery during early morning hours, then yes, that is exactly what we're saying. But 7 a.m. isn't early for most people who work, Greg argued. And it's after the restricted hours in the bylaws. The meeting devolved from there. What had been intended as a straightforward disciplinary hearing turned into a broader debate about HOA overreach and what restrictions were reasonable for Alaskan living. About half the attendees seemed to side with Sharon, mostly older retirees who valued peace and quiet above all else. The other half seemed more sympathetic to my position, recognizing that snowmobiles were a practical and common mode of transportation in Alaska. Finally, after nearly 90 minutes, Harold Mitchell suggested they postpone any decision until the board could consult with their HOA attorney. Sharon looked furious, but had to agree when the other board members voted 3-1 in favor of the postponement. Only Sharon and Patricia Holmes voted against it. As people filed out, several residents came up to me to offer support. Greg Norton gave me his phone number and said he'd been intimidated out of using his own snowmobile by Sharon's tactics the previous winter. Louise Patterson told me to keep fighting because Sharon had previously gone after her son for parking a work truck in his driveway overnight, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic, but also exhausted. This was not the peaceful Alaskan experience I had envisioned. The weekend passed without incident. I used my snowmobile both Saturday and Sunday morning, making sure to wait until exactly 7 a.m. each time and documenting the times and noise levels. On Monday, I received an email from Harold Mitchell saying the board had consulted with their attorney, who had advised them that my snowmobile use appeared to be within the bounds of both the HOA bylaws and state law, but that they were considering amending the bylaws to add specific restrictions on snowmobiles. That seemed like a reasonable compromise, honestly. If they wanted to have a community vote on changing the rules, that was their right. I could accept democratic decision-making. What I could not accept was Sharon making up rules on the spot based on her personal preferences. On Tuesday morning, I was warming up my snowmobile at 7 a.m. sharp when a Fairbanks Police Department cruiser pulled up in front of my house. My stomach dropped. I killed the engine and waited as an officer stepped out. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with a professional demeanor as he approached. "Morning," he said. "I'm Officer Jake Reynolds. I got a call about a noise complaint. Are you Derek Sullivan?" "I am," I said, feeling my heart pounding. "Officer, I've been very careful to follow all the rules. I only operate this after 7 a.m., and I've measured the noise levels to make sure they are within legal limits." Officer Reynolds held up a hand. "Why don't you explain the situation to me from your perspective?" I gave him the whole story, from Sharon's first visit to the HOA meeting. I showed him the bylaws on my phone, the decibel readings, and my detailed log. He listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. "All right," he said when I finished. "Here's the thing. Snowmobiles are legal to operate on most streets in this area. I checked before I came over. The borough does have noise ordinances, but they're pretty reasonable, and from what you're telling me, you're well within compliance. Can you start it up so I can hear it?" I did as he asked, letting the engine run for about 30 seconds before shutting it off. Officer Reynolds nodded. "That's not particularly loud. I mean, it's not silent, but it's about the same as a motorcycle or a loud truck. Who made the complaint?" "I'm guessing Sharon Winters, the HOA president. She lives in that house there," I said, pointing to a large 2-story home about 4 houses down. "Let me go talk to her," Officer Reynolds said. "Wait here." I watched as he walked down the street and knocked on Sharon's door. She must have been watching because she opened it almost immediately. I could not hear what was being said, but I could see her gesturing emphatically toward my house. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes, with Sharon's body language becoming increasingly agitated. Then something unexpected happened. Officer Reynolds pulled out his citation book and appeared to be writing something. Sharon's voice rose loud enough that I could hear her shrieking, though I could not make out the words. The officer remained calm, handed her something, and walked back toward my house. "So, here's what's happening," Officer Reynolds said when he returned. "Miss Winters admitted she called in the complaint. However, she also admitted that you're operating the snowmobile after 7 a.m., which is when the local noise ordinance restrictions end. When I explained that you weren't violating any laws, she became verbally abusive, and her shouting actually constituted a noise disturbance itself." I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. "You're saying—" "I issued her a citation for creating a public disturbance. The fine is $150. She's understandably upset about it, but she needs to understand that calling the police for non-emergencies and making false complaints wastes public resources." He handed me a business card. "If she continues to harass you about legal activity, give me a call. This is my direct number. I've made a note in the system about this address." "Thank you," I managed to say. "I really appreciate you taking the time to understand the situation." Officer Reynolds nodded. "Look, I get it. HOAs can be tricky, but they don't override state or local law. You've got the right to use your legally registered vehicle in a legal manner. Just keep doing what you're doing, being considerate about timing and noise levels. You're being a good neighbor. It's too bad not everyone can say the same." He drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway trying to process what had just happened. Sharon Winters, the tyrannical HOA president who had been making my life miserable, had just been given a noise citation by the police. I almost wanted to laugh at the irony. The laughter did not last long. Within an hour, my email inbox exploded. Sharon had sent a message to what appeared to be the entire Pinewood Estates community email list, claiming I had made false allegations to the police, that I was harassing her, and that I was trying to destroy the peaceful character of the neighborhood. The email was unhinged, full of capital letters and exclamation points, and made me sound like a dangerous criminal. I did not respond directly, but I did forward the entire email chain to Harold Mitchell with a note explaining what had actually happened and offering to provide Officer Reynolds's contact information if they wanted to verify my account. Harold called me within 10 minutes. "Derek, I owe you an apology. I've been on this board for 3 years and I've watched Sharon bully people again and again. I've tried to push back, but she's got Patricia firmly in her corner and Robert usually just goes along with whatever they say. Jennifer and I have been outvoted on multiple issues. Why do people keep voting her in as president?" I asked. Harold sighed. "Because she runs unopposed. Most people don't want to deal with the headache of being on the HOA board, and Sharon makes it clear she'll make life hell for anyone who challenges her. But this has gone too far. I'm going to call for an emergency board meeting to discuss her conduct." "I appreciate that," I said. "But honestly, I just want to be left alone to live my life. I'm not trying to cause problems." "I know you're not, and that's exactly why this needs to stop." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday evening. In the meantime, I continued my routine, using the snowmobile each morning to access the trails. A few neighbors who I had never met before stopped me to express their support. One of them, a man named Tom Richards who lived on the next street over, told me he was thinking about running for the board in the next election cycle, specifically because of how Sharon had handled this situation. Friday evening, I arrived at the community center to find it much more crowded than the previous meeting. Word had apparently spread, and at least 50 residents were in attendance. The energy in the room was tense, with clear factions forming. Sharon's supporters sat on the left side of the room, while those who seemed more sympathetic to my situation sat on the right. I chose a seat near the back, wanting to stay out of the spotlight if possible. Sharon called the meeting to order, but before she could launch into whatever speech she had prepared, Harold Mitchell interrupted her. "Sharon, before we begin, I need to address some serious concerns about your conduct as HOA president." Sharon's eyes narrowed. "This is not the time, Harold." "It absolutely is the time," Harold said firmly. "You have been abusing your position to harass a homeowner who is engaging in legal activity. You filed a false police report, which resulted in you receiving a citation. You then sent a defamatory email to the entire community. This behavior is unacceptable and reflects poorly on this board." The room erupted. Sharon's supporters began shouting that Harold was out of line, while others applauded his willingness to confront her. Sharon herself looked like she might spontaneously combust. "How dare you?" she hissed. "I have given 6 years of my life to this community. I have maintained property values, enforced standards, and kept this neighborhood from turning into a trashy mess. And this is the thanks I get." Jennifer Crawford, the secretary, spoke up. "Sharon, we all appreciate your dedication. But Harold is right. This situation has gotten out of hand. We need to step back and reassess." "Reassess what?" Sharon demanded. "The fact that we have a resident who thinks rules don't apply to him, who operates dangerous machinery at all hours and doesn't care who it disturbs." "It's not all hours," I said, surprising myself by speaking up. "It's after 7 a.m., which is when your own bylaws say is acceptable. And it's not dangerous. It's a registered vehicle I'm operating legally." Sharon spun to face me. "You've been nothing but trouble since you moved here. You think because you're from the lower 48 that you can come here and tell us how to run our community." "I'm not telling anyone how to run anything," I said, keeping my voice level. I'm asking to be allowed to live according to the rules that were in place when I purchased my home. Maybe you should have thought about that before you moved into a community with standards, Sharon shot back. An elderly man in the front row stood up. Sharon, I've lived in Pinewood Estates since it was developed 20 years ago. I served on the original HOA board. And I'm telling you right now, we never intended for the rules to be used to prevent people from normal Alaskan activities. Snowmobiles, ATVs, these are part of life here. If someone's being reasonable about when and how they use them, we should be encouraging that outdoor lifestyle, not punishing it. Thank you, Martin, Harold said. I think that perspective is important. Now, I'd like to make a motion that we censure Sharon Winters for abuse of her position as HOA president and recommend that she step down. The room went completely silent. Sharon looked like she had been slapped. You cannot do that, she whispered. Actually, according to our bylaws, we can, Jennifer said, pulling out a copy of the governing documents. Section 4, Paragraph 8. A board member can be censured or removed by a majority vote of the remaining board members if they engage in conduct detrimental to the community. This is a coup, Sharon said, her voice rising. You're all ganging up on me because I actually enforce the rules instead of letting everyone do whatever they want. Robert Daniels, who had been silent up until this point, cleared his throat. Sharon, I've supported you on a lot of things over the years, but you crossed a line here. You called the police on a man who was following the rules and then you lied about it to the community. I can't defend that. Harold called for a vote. The motion to censure Sharon Winters passed 4-1 with only Patricia Holmes voting against it. The motion for her to step down as president also passed 4-1. Sharon stood up, her face purple with rage. Fine. You want to run this community into the ground without me? Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when property values plummet and this place turns into a slum. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, with Patricia Holmes hurrying after her. The room remained tense as Harold took over as acting president and tried to restore order. The meeting continued for another hour, covering routine business and discussing the process for electing a new president. Several people suggested Harold should take the role permanently, and he agreed to serve until a proper election could be held. Before adjourning, they passed a motion to formally recognize that snowmobiles and other recreational vehicles were permitted in Pinewood Estates as long as they complied with noise restrictions and were operated safely. As I left the community center, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. I had not wanted to cause this level of drama. I had just wanted to use my snowmobile. Tom Richards caught up with me in the parking lot. Hey, Derek. I know that was intense, but you did the right thing standing your ground. Sharon needed to be checked. She's been terrorizing people for years. I just hope the community can move forward from this, I said. We will. Honestly, this might be the best thing that could have happened. People have been afraid to speak up against her, but now that someone finally did, I think you'll see a lot more engagement from reasonable folks who have been staying quiet. Over the next few weeks, things gradually settled into a new normal. Harold Mitchell proved to be a fair and reasonable HOA president, focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary standards. He organized a community survey about various rules and regulations, and the feedback was overwhelmingly in favor of loosening restrictions on things like recreational vehicles, holiday decorations, and landscaping choices. Sharon, true to her word, disengaged entirely from the community. I saw her leaving her house occasionally, but she never acknowledged any neighbors and seemed to leave the subdivision almost immediately. Patricia Holmes resigned from the board in protest, and 2 new members were elected in a special election. Tom Richards, and a woman named Susan Chen who worked as a civil engineer. I continued using my snowmobile regularly, and soon several other residents began doing the same. Greg Norton started joining me on weekend trail rides, and we discovered we had a lot in common. He had also moved to Alaska seeking a fresh start after a divorce, and we bonded over our shared experiences of starting over in a new place. Louise Patterson's husband Frank turned out to be an experienced ice fisherman, and he invited me along on a trip to Harding Lake. We spent a Saturday drilling holes through 3 feet of ice and catching northern pike, while he shared stories about 40 years of living in Alaska. It reminded me that community was about more than just HOA rules and property values. It was about people connecting and supporting each other. In March, as the days grew longer and the temperature started to climb above freezing, I received a notice that Sharon and her husband were selling their house and moving to Arizona. The listing price was surprisingly low, and the house sold within a week to a young couple with 2 kids who were transferring to Fairbanks for military service at Fort Wainwright. I met them when they came to view the neighborhood, a friendly pair named Chris and Amanda who were excited about the outdoor opportunities Alaska offered. They asked about snowmobile trails, sledding hills, and whether the nearby lake was good for skating. It was a stark contrast to Sharon's priorities. By the time April arrived and the snow began to melt, Pinewood Estates felt like a different place. The HOA board had been rebuilt with people who actually cared about fostering a sense of community rather than enforcing arbitrary standards. Neighborhood barbecues were planned. A community garden was proposed, and there was talk of organizing group outdoor activities like hiking and fishing trips. I had traded in my snowmobile for a 4-wheeler as summer approached, and Harold confirmed with a knowing smile that those were also perfectly acceptable under the revised guidelines. The trails that had been blanketed in snow during winter transformed into muddy paths through the boreal forest, equally fun to explore in the warmer months. One evening in late April, I was working in my garage when Tom Richards stopped by with a 6-pack of beer and an invitation to join a fishing tournament his office was organizing. "You know," he said as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset, "when you first moved here and this whole thing went down, I thought it was going to tear the neighborhood apart, but I think it actually brought us together." I nodded, sipping my beer. "It's funny how that works. I was just trying to live my life and enjoy what Alaska has to offer. I never expected to end up in the middle of an HOA civil war." "Sometimes the right fight finds you," Tom said. "Sharon needed someone to stand up to her. The rest of us were too beaten down or too conflict-averse to do it. You being new here, you didn't have that history of intimidation. You just saw an unfair situation and pushed back. I just didn't want to be told I couldn't use my legally owned vehicle on my own property," I said. "It seemed pretty straightforward." Tom laughed. "See, that's the thing. It was straightforward. But Sharon had convinced everyone that up was down and left was right for so long that people forgot what reasonable actually looked like." As the evening faded to the brief darkness of an Alaskan spring night, I reflected on the past few months. Moving to Alaska had been about escaping the grief that had consumed me in Seattle, about finding a new purpose and new experiences. I had expected the challenge of adapting to the extreme weather, the long winter nights, the isolation of living so far north. What I had not expected was a battle with a homeowners association president who could not stand the idea of someone using a snowmobile in Alaska. But in fighting that battle, I had found something I had been missing since Deanna died, a sense of purpose and belonging. The community that had rallied around the issue, the neighbors who had become friends, the simple act of standing up for what was right, all of it had helped me heal in ways I had not anticipated. The summer passed quickly. I explored the trail systems on my four-wheeler, went fishing with Frank Patterson and his buddies, helped Tom Richards build a new deck on his house, and even started dating a woman named Rebecca who worked at the local library. She had heard about the great Snowmobile controversy, as it had become known in Pinewood Estates, and thought it was hilarious that such a quintessentially Alaskan activity had caused such drama. In September, as the first snow began to dust the peaks of the Alaska Range visible in the distance, I got my snowmobile out of storage and gave it a thorough maintenance check. The nights were getting longer again, and the temperature was starting to drop. Soon the trails would be ready for another season. On the first proper snow day in October, I waited until 7 a.m., started my snowmobile and headed out for the trails. The morning was beautiful, the fresh snow pristine, and the air so cold it hurt to breathe. As I rode through the forest, I thought about how much had changed in the year since I had first moved to Pinewood Estates. When I returned home around 9, Harold Mitchell was outside his house getting into his truck. He waved as I pulled into my driveway. "Good ride," he called out. "Great ride," I called back. "That's what Alaska's all about," he said with a grin before driving off. I went inside, made myself breakfast, and got ready for work. Through the kitchen window, I could see my snowmobile sitting in the driveway, ready for the next adventure. No angry HOA president would be showing up to tell me I could not use it. No threatening letters would be taped to my door. No police would be called to investigate a non-existent violation. In November, the community held its first annual Pinewood Estates Winter Festival. It was Harold's idea, a way to celebrate the season rather than just endure it. There were ice sculptures, a bonfire, sledding races for kids, and yes, snowmobile demonstrations. Several local businesses donated prizes, and the Fairbanks News Miner even sent a reporter to cover it. I volunteered to help organize the snowmobile demonstration, and we set up a safe course where people could try riding under supervision. It was hugely popular, especially with kids who had never been on one before. Watching families enjoy the activity that had caused so much controversy just months earlier felt vindicating. As December arrived, and the days shrank to just a few hours of twilight, I found myself truly happy for the first time since Deanna's death. Alaska had not been an escape after all. It had been a rediscovery of who I was and what mattered to me. The fight with Sharon and the HOA had been frustrating and stressful, but it had also forced me to engage with my community, to stand up for my principles, and to connect with people in meaningful ways. On Christmas Eve, a group of neighbors gathered at my house for a potluck dinner. Harold and his wife brought homemade tamales. Tom and his girlfriend brought a massive salad. The new family who had bought Sharon's old house brought cookies their kids had decorated, and at least a dozen other neighbors contributed various dishes. We ate, told stories, and laughed until late into the night. As everyone was leaving, Greg Norton pulled me aside. "Hey man, I just want to say thanks." "For what?" I asked. "For not backing down. For showing me and a lot of other people that it's okay to stand up when something isn't right. I let Sharon push me around last year, and it made me feel weak. Watching you handle it with dignity but also firmness, that taught me something important." I did not really know what to say to that. I had just been trying to defend my right to use my snowmobile. But I understood what he meant. Sometimes taking a stand on something small sends ripples much farther than we realize. January brought the coldest temperatures of the winter, with several days where the thermometer did not climb above -20. My snowmobile became more than just a recreational vehicle during that stretch. It was actually the most reliable way to get to the main road when my truck struggled to start in the extreme cold. The irony was not lost on me that the vehicle Sharon had claimed was unnecessary and inappropriate had become an essential tool for winter survival. In February, the HOA held its annual general meeting and election of officers. Harold was elected president with near unanimous support. Tom Richards became vice president, and Susan Chen took over as treasurer. The board presented a revised set of bylaws that had been developed with extensive community input. The changes were reasonable and reflected the reality of living in Alaska. Snowmobiles, ATVs, and other recreational vehicles were explicitly permitted as long as they were used responsibly. Noise restrictions were clarified with specific decibel limits and time windows, and there was a new grievance process that required documentation and evidence before fines could be issued. The revisions passed with 87% approval from voting homeowners. It felt like a new chapter for Pinewood Estates, one based on mutual respect and common sense rather than arbitrary enforcement of petty rules. I never heard from Sharon Winters again. Occasionally, someone would mention seeing her Facebook posts about how much she loved Arizona and how nice it was to live somewhere civilized. I did not take it personally. Some people were never going to understand that different places had different cultures and values. Alaska was never going to be a manicured suburb where every lawn looked identical and everyone lived according to rigid standards. It was a place where practicality and outdoor lifestyle took precedence over appearances. As March arrived and the days grew longer again, I began planning a major trip for the summer. A multi-day four-wheeler expedition through Denali Highway with Greg, Tom, and a few other guys from the neighborhood. Deanna would have loved the idea. She had always encouraged me to embrace new experiences and adventures. I like to think she would have been proud of how I had handled the situation with the HOA standing firm, but not letting it consume me with bitterness. One afternoon in late March, I was in my garage doing maintenance on my snowmobile when a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. A middle-aged man in a business suit got out, carrying a briefcase. "Derek Sullivan?" he asked. "That's me," I said cautiously. "My name is James Burton. I'm an attorney representing Sharon and David Winters. I need to speak with you about a legal matter." My stomach dropped. Of course Sharon would not just let this go. "What kind of legal matter?" "The Winters are filing a civil suit against you for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. They're seeking $50,000 in damages." He handed me an envelope. "You've been served." I stood there holding the envelope, trying to process what I was hearing. This is insane. I didn't harass or defame anyone. I just used my legally owned snowmobile. "That's something you'll need to address with your own attorney," Burton said. "The complaint alleges that your actions and the subsequent fallout caused Mrs. Winters significant emotional distress and forced them to sell their home at a loss." He got back in his car and drove off, leaving me standing in my garage feeling like I had been punched in the gut. After everything that had happened, after Sharon had been censured by her own board and had moved to another state, she was still trying to punish me. I called Marcus Thompson first, then Officer Reynolds, and finally a real estate attorney named Patricia Yu, who had been recommended by several people in the community. Patricia agreed to meet with me the next day to review the complaint. When I arrived at her office in downtown Fairbanks, Patricia was already familiar with the situation. Apparently, word of the Pinewood Estates HOA drama had spread throughout the local legal community. "This is a nuisance suit," Patricia said after reviewing the complaint. "Sharon is angry and vindictive, and she's trying to intimidate you into paying her to go away." The good news is that her claims are baseless. You have documentation of everything, you have witnesses including a police officer, and you have the HOA board's own actions censuring her. The bad news is that defending yourself will cost money and time. So what do? I asked. We file a response denying all claims and we prepare for discovery. I'll also look into whether we can countersue for malicious prosecution. If we can prove she filed this suit without any reasonable legal basis purely to harass you, you might be able to recover your legal fees. Over the next few months, the legal process ground forward at its typically glacial pace. Sharon's attorneys sent interrogatories and document requests. We responded with our own. Depositions were scheduled. The whole thing was exhausting and expensive, even though Patricia was being reasonable about her fees. The community rallied around me once again. Harold Mitchell wrote a detailed affidavit describing Sharon's pattern of behavior as HOA president. Officer Reynolds provided a copy of his incident report from the morning he had cited Sharon for noise disturbance. Greg Norton, Tom Richards, and at least a dozen other neighbors submitted statements supporting my version of events. In July, Patricia called me with good news. Sharon's attorneys want to settle. They're offering to drop the suit if you agree not to countersue. That's it. No apology, no payment, I asked. That's it. My guess is they realized how weak their case is once they saw all the evidence we have. They're trying to cut their losses. What do you think I should do? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Honestly, take it. You could probably win a countersuit, but it would drag this out for at least another year. The emotional toll and the legal fees might not be worth it, even if you eventually recover them. Sometimes the best victory is just getting back to your normal life. I thought about Deanna and what she would have advised. She had always been practical, focused on what truly mattered rather than winning every battle. Okay, I said, let's accept the settlement. The paperwork was finalized in August, and the case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Sharon could not refile the same claims. Patricia had managed to negotiate that I would not be responsible for any of Sharon's legal fees, which was a small but meaningful victory. With the lawsuit behind me, I could finally relax and enjoy the rest of the summer. The four-wheeler trip through Denali Highway was everything I had hoped for. We spent 5 days camping in the wilderness, riding through terrain that few people ever experienced, and bonding over shared adventures and stories around the campfire. When September arrived and the first snow began to fall again, I felt a sense of completion. The full cycle of seasons in Alaska had taught me resilience, patience, and the value of standing up for what was right while also knowing when to let go and move forward. My snowmobile came out of storage again, and on the first proper snow day, I started it up at 7 a.m. and headed out to the trails. The familiar rumble of the engine, the crisp morning air, the endless expanse of white landscape stretching out before me, all of it felt like home in a way that Seattle never had after Deanna died. As I rode through the forest, I thought about everything that had happened since that first morning when Sharon Winters had shown up at my door with her threats and her outrage. The conflict had been unpleasant, but it had led to positive changes in the community and had helped me find my place in Alaska. In October, Pinewood Estates held its second annual winter festival, even bigger and better than the first year. The snowmobile demonstrations were expanded, and we even organized a charity ride to raise money for the local food bank. The event raised over $10,000 and brought the community together in ways that would have been impossible under Sharon's rigid leadership. On a cold November evening, I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Harold Mitchell standing there with a bottle of whiskey and a grin. "Thought you might want to share a drink," he said. We sat in my living room, sipping whiskey and talking about everything from HOA politics to the best fishing spots to our families and our pasts. Harold told me about his late wife who had passed away 5 years earlier, and I shared stories about Deanna. There was something healing about being able to talk about her with someone who understood that kind of loss. "You know," Harold said as he was leaving, "when you first moved here and this whole thing started with Sharon, I was worried it would destroy the community. But looking back, I think it saved us. We needed someone to stand up and remind us what really mattered. So thank you for that." After he left, I stood on my front porch looking out at the quiet street. Lights glowed in windows up and down Timber Lane. Snowmobiles and four-wheelers sat in several driveways, ready for the next adventure. The neighborhood felt alive in a way that rules and restrictions could never create. As December brought the darkest days of winter, the community came together even more. Holiday parties, group snowshoe hikes, ice skating on the nearby lake, all of it organized by neighbors who had found their voice after years of staying silent. Pinewood Estates had transformed from a place where people felt watched and judged into a place where people felt connected and supported. On Christmas morning, I woke up early and took my snowmobile out for a solo ride. The trail was empty, the world silent except for the sound of my engine and the soft crunch of snow under the track. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. In that moment, I felt Deanna's presence more strongly than I had in years. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a part of who I had become through the experience of losing her and learning to live again. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The grief that had driven me from Seattle, the conflict with Sharon that had forced me to engage with my new community, the friends I had made, the life I had built. None of it was what I had planned or expected, but it was good, it was real, and it was mine. When I returned home an hour later, my phone had several messages from neighbors wishing me Merry Christmas and inviting me to various gatherings throughout the day. I responded to each one, accepting invitations and making plans. This was what community was supposed to be. People choosing to care for each other and support each other, not because rules forced them to, but because it made life richer and more meaningful. As the second winter in Alaska continued, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. I was dating Rebecca more seriously, and we had started talking about maybe moving in together. My job at the telecommunications company had led to a promotion. The friendships I had made in Pinewood Estates had deepened into genuine connections that I knew would last for years. The snowmobile that had started this whole journey sat in my garage, a symbol of both conflict and resolution. It represented my refusal to be bullied or intimidated, but also my commitment to living life on my own terms while respecting others. Sharon Winters had tried to use it as a weapon against me, to paint me as a troublemaker who did not respect community standards. Instead, it had become a catalyst for positive change, forcing the community to examine its values and priorities. In late January, I received a letter from Sharon's attorney. My first instinct was dread, worried that she was trying to restart the legal battle. But when I opened it, I found something unexpected. A check for $8,000 and a brief note explaining that Sharon had been ordered to pay my legal fees as part of a separate complaint filed by the Arizona Homeowners Association in her new community. Apparently, she had tried to pull similar tactics there, but Arizona had much stricter laws about HOA overreach. The case had resulted in Sharon being fined and banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. I stared at the check, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Sharon had been so consumed by her need for control and her belief that she knew best how everyone should live that she had destroyed her own credibility and reputation. I did not feel happy about her downfall, but I also did not feel guilty. She had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. I deposited the check and used part of it to pay off the remainder of my legal fees. The rest I donated to the community fund that had been established to maintain the trails and outdoor spaces around Pinewood Estates. It seemed appropriate that money from the conflict would be used to support the very activities Sharon had tried to prevent. As February brought slightly longer days and the promise of spring, I began planning another summer adventure. A fishing trip to the Kenai Peninsula with Frank Patterson and several other neighbors. We would spend a week chasing salmon and halibut, camping under the midnight sun and swapping stories around the campfire. It was the kind of experience that had drawn me to Alaska in the first place, and I was grateful that I had fought to preserve my ability to live this kind of life. The transformation of Pinewood Estates was complete by the time the second annual election came around. The HOA board was filled with people who saw their role as facilitating community rather than enforcing conformity. Rules existed to prevent genuine problems, not to micromanage personal choices. And most importantly, neighbors looked out for each other not because they were afraid of fines or citations, but because they genuinely cared. On the first warm day of spring, when the temperature climbed above 40 degrees and the snow began to melt in earnest, I put my snowmobile away for the season and got my four-wheeler ready. The cycle would continue. Winter and summer, snow and sun, machines built for different terrains but the same purpose of exploration and adventure. As I stood in my garage, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for when I left Seattle. Not an escape from grief, but a path through it. Not a place to hide from the world, but a community where I belonged. Not a life without conflict, but the strength to face conflict with integrity and courage. The snowmobile sat quietly in the corner, its engine silent but ready. It had been more than just a vehicle or a hobby. It had been the catalyst for change, the line in the sand that forced me and my community to decide what kind of place we wanted to be. And in standing firm about something as simple as the right to use a legally owned vehicle on my own property, I had helped create something much more valuable, a community built on respect, reason, and genuine connection. Winter would come again, as it always did in Alaska. The snow would fall, the trails would beckon, and my snowmobile would roar back to life. But this time, there would be no threatening letters, no HOA president showing up to complain, no police calls or legal battles. There would just be the freedom to live, to explore, and to enjoy the incredible landscape that had become my home. And that, ultimately, was all I had ever wanted.